All right, everyone. Thank you very much for coming this morning. Sorry we're getting started a few minutes late, but welcome today. So this is a discussion hosted by Saferworld, which some of you will have come across before, some of you might not have. And we're a conflict prevention organisation, and we have programmes in Yemen and a team on the ground in Yemen. My name's Leonie Northedge. I'm going to be moderating the discussion today. I'm the Middle East and North Africa Programme Manager for Saferworld. So today we're going to be discussing a paper we published recently, which was written by Peter Salisbury on the question of federalism in Yemen, and more broadly on the question of peace negotiations and dialogue and what is the way forward in Yemen. So Peter, who we're very glad to have today, is a journalist and analyst. He's also currently an associate fellow at the think tank Chatham House. And he publishes frequently on Yemen, including, some of you may have seen recently, a piece that he published for the Washington Post, which refers quite a lot to this more in-depth report that he's published for us. And after Peter has presented the report, we'll have Baraa Shiban responding to him. We're also very glad to have him today. Baraa is a coordinator at the human rights organisation Reprieve, and for those of you who don't know Reprieve focuses specifically on abuses which have been committed within the scope of the war on terror. And Baraa was also a member of the National Dialogue Conference in Yemen, so he has very hands-on experience of that process. So today, Peter will present the report for about 10-15 minutes. Baraa will respond, and then we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for questions and comments and discussion. And I should let you know that today the discussion is on the record, and we'll be publishing some kind of summary of the discussion afterwards. And then just a final point on housekeeping, which is that if the fire alarm goes off, please go down the main stairs and then go outside, and everyone should convene on the street. And if you need to know where the toilets are, they are opposite the lift. All right, thank you very much, everyone. And Peter, please go ahead.
All right, good morning. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. Thank you to Saferworld both for publishing this report and for arranging this workshop this morning. I'm going to try and keep my comments relatively short. I'll stick to about 10 minutes, but I've said that before. We'll see how I do. And what I really want to do is talk through, first and foremost, the genesis of this paper and how it evolved along with the situation on the ground in Yemen and how that came to inform the finished product. So we started work on this paper in early 2014, just as the National Dialogue Conference was drawing to an end in Sana'a. And the major topic of discussion at that point had become federalism, whether or not a federal model was the best way to create a more stable and secure Yemen in the future. As we discuss this question about how it could create local security, local buy-in to a national political system, a more accountable system of governance, we really came to ask this core research question, which is whether or not federalism in general was a tool for peace and stability, and whether Yemen in particular would be helped by a federal model. So what the paper does, and this was the early core bit of research, was to look at federal models elsewhere, look at the logic behind and the drivers of the implementation of federalism in other countries. And what we found was that, statistically speaking at least, federalism is actually no better or worse a system of governance than any other. And as we write in the paper, federalism, there are as many kinds of federalism as there are countries with federal states. Federalism is a pretty broad catch-all term, and the main function of a federal system of governance as enshrined in a constitution is that, opposed to decentralization, say, it makes it law that this decentralized system, this system of local governance is there, which creates a greater incentive for local councils, for local groups to try and make sure that this system remains intact. But when you look at the number of countries that have implemented federalism over the past 50 years or so, or the last 30 years, should we say, during what we describe as the second wave of federal implementation, it's normally in post-conflict states. It's in countries with deep regional and ethnic or sectarian tensions, and there is very little statistical evidence, at least, that it improves or worsens the situation more than any other system of governance. And the main argument we make in the paper is that the success of a federal system depends on buy-in among the general population and political will at a centralised elite level. So if the people in a country want a federal system and the elite of the country are willing to see it implemented, and federal systems often work counter the interests of the elite, then the system will work. But if the elite don't want it and the people don't want it, and equally importantly, if the people don't understand what it is, then it's very difficult to argue that federalism works. It tends to just be sort of an adjunct, a side issue. Federalism is a great idea, but it requires a great deal of work and cooperation to become a functional system. And one of the other findings we came to when looking at other federal systems, and this is possibly the most important, and my mind's gone blank as I say this, so I'm doing well this morning, sorry, I need one more coffee. Federalism requires a great deal of work and cooperation to become a functional system, but it tends to work best in places where there is already a system of governance in place. Decentralizing governance is a great idea, but it tends to work best where there is infrastructure, where basic services are intact, where the government is already providing services, and all you are doing is taking those services and making them more accountable and more transparent to the populations they serve. Whereas in countries where that infrastructure does not exist, where those institutions do not exist at a local level, often what you're doing is trying to create an extra, more expensive layer of bureaucracy, which was realistically going to be the case in Yemen. Now, in terms of Yemen itself, federalism to this day is being posed as a problem to the country's many governance problems. But during the course of the transition, it became clear, to me at least, and this is the argument that we make in the paper, that federalism was something of a MacGuffin. It tended to be something that misdirected attention away from the core issues that face Yemenis on a day-to-day basis. And in many ways, that to me was symbolic of the way that the transition was run. There was this wonderful national dialogue conference in Sana'a, where people talked about a bright utopian future for Yemen, about how it would be a society based on the rule of law, about how services would be provided, about how security would be provided. But the reality for Yemenis on a day-to-day basis on the ground was a worsening security, economic environment, worsening provision of basic services where they had been provided before, and a general loss of confidence in the government itself. And this was really the issue that we came to in the first half of 2014. And this is why I think it's important to explain how this paper evolved. Because what's happened since September of 2014 is this new argument has come through. That the transition, in fact, was going wonderfully well. And if it wasn't for the Houthis, then we'd have a utopian federal Yemen. And I'm afraid to say that over the course of the research, this core argument of how are you going to provide federal services when no services are already not being provided? How are you going to create political will, political buy-in to this system when people are just fed up with the idea of any system of governance? How are you going to implement this system when the government itself does not appear to be capable or willing of doing any work at a local level? That became the core question for me. So, I mean, yeah, it was symbolic of the way that the transition was being run. Lofty goals and promises of a bright future were discussed in public, while the day-to-day reality was one of inter-elite fighting and a worsening environment on a day-to-day basis for most Yemenis. Now, the events of the last year have somewhat overtaken the paper's original question. Federalism was never really given a chance. It hasn't been tried out, so who knows? Maybe it would have worked and maybe I'm wrong. But once again, today, federalism is being discussed as a solution to the current Yemeni conflict. It's something that the government in Riyadh is again and again saying is what will help the country get out of its current mess. But again, I believe that this is something of a case of, at the very best, putting the horse before the cart. And this comes back to the key findings when we looked at other countries. Before decentralization as a system of governance, or federalism as a system of governance, can be implemented, there has to be local service delivery, and there has to be local buy-in to such a product and to the idea of a state in and of itself, which is a particular problem in Yemen's south, where psychologically at least unity has already ended and a de facto state is being built. Now this isn't discussed in the paper, which was completed in around June or July of this year, when things were very hazy in terms of what was happening in Yemen. But I think that given the government in Riyadh is now saying that federalism is the way forward for Yemen, it's important to look at territories which are known at least under the control of that government to see the extent to which rhetoric and reality match up with one another. It's a shame that Nadwa Al-Dawsari isn't here today. She's flying into London for a workshop that will be running at Chatham House over the next couple of days. But I'd really like to direct you all to a paper that she wrote for the Project on Middle East Democracy, which you can find on the internet, about the current situation in the south of Yemen. A big complaint about analysis and research in Yemen is that it tends to focus on Sana'a. I've done my best, although not enough, over the past few years to focus on the south of the country in particular, wherever I possibly can. And in the south, I'm not sure sort of how much expertise we've got in the room, but I think quite a lot. In the south, there are long-standing grievances that have been in place since the 1994 Civil War, since Southerners tried to undo a 4-year-old unity with the North, about the extent to which they have been politically and economically marginalised, and the extent to which resources, oil and gas, or oil more realistically, produced in the south of the country has not been recycled back into infrastructure and basic services in the south of the country. And this really evolved and metastasized over the course of the 2000s into a very strong independence movement. And what we saw during the early stages of Yemen's war was realistically an inter-regional conflict between Northern Highland forces and surprisingly effective resistant forces in the south. Now, if you look at the people who took up arms to fight and later push the Houthis out in the south of the country, they were ordinary citizens. They were not members of the popular committees that had been put together over the previous years. They were not members of the extant Yemeni military. By and large, they were local people who shared AK-47s, one AK to 4 men, and fought the Houthis out. That requires a great deal of effort. That requires genuine passion. And what you have right now is a large number of relatively heavily armed young men who have one goal and one goal only, and that is secession. Now, nowhere is there a greater test of the government's ability to create the political buy-in that will be required to allow a system of governance to be brought in Yemen, any kind of system of governance that creates some degree of centralized role, let alone federalism. So the question that I wanted to sort of really pose was, to what extent has the government and the coalition that backs them been trying to implement governance, to provide some security, to provide basic services on the ground, and to provide humanitarian aid to parts of the south where the humanitarian system is indeed catastrophic, specifically areas around Lahej and Al-Dara, where the situation is really, really terrible, where people don't have water, they don't have food, and they don't have medicine. I'm very, very sad to say that simply has not happened. So again, we have this rhetoric of federalism sorting the problem, but we have a lack of will on the part of the government to govern on behalf of the people. We even see that the southern resistance fighters are providing basic security across the country, sometimes not very much security, but they're manning checkpoints, they're checking vehicles, and they're trying to sort of maintain an effective border. And their main complaint is that several months after having seen the government in Riyadh declare the liberation of the south and the integration of their militias into the military, that has not happened. They complain the appointees of governors and into local government are political appointees who are being made on the basis of loyalty rather than competence and understanding of local areas. Long-standing problems in Yemen, not limited to this government by any means whatsoever, but we are seeing a repetition of the same set of problems. So when we start looking towards post-conflict solutions, the thought that I will leave you with is this. We can discuss federalism until we are blue in the face, and as a concept, it's a wonderful idea. But until such a point as the government in Yemen, whatever form it may take, focuses on addressing the basic day-to-day needs of the Yemeni people, of providing some level of services and some level of security, and not hiding behind this constant complaint that it is very, very hard to do that. If that's the case, then, go do something else that's easier. I didn't say that. This is on the record briefing, it's fine. And that goes for everyone who's been involved in governance in Yemen for the past 3 decades. This isn't specific to the current government in Riyadh. But until that happens, federalism as a conversation is almost entirely without value until such a time as there is political buy-in at a local level to any kind of system of governance. Federalism will not be a solution of any kind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And now I'd like to hand over to Baraa to respond to that presentation.
Thank you, Peter. I think many of the points that Peter addressed are points actually I do agree with. There has been challenges over the past 3 years that faced Hadi's government, and the general conclusion that Hadi didn't tackle those challenges quite efficiently, let's say. Now, government, like federalism, would have it worked? Maybe, and maybe not. But let me address some just a historical roundup on how did we reach from a very centralized government, and how unity was one day one of the brightest, maybe biggest inventions that Yemenis would like to pride themselves with, to the level that now we're discussing federalism, and federalism is the solution. Let's begin in 1994. After 1994, and after the former Socialist Party leaders were forced out of the country, the government could have remained centralized if many of the issues that Peter addressed in his presentation were met to many of the people, specifically in the South. So if the government was able to provide basic services, provide security, and provide some type of a system that the people in the South felt that they are included within the system. One of the many complaints that I received during my work in the National Dialogue is, if you are a guy, let's say in Mahara, that's very in the south east of Yemen, it's almost impossible to get a scholarship because the system is very centralized. A guy from Mahara has to travel. If he graduated from high school, even with very great results, he needs to fly all the way to Sana'a and start processing his papers to get a scholarship from the government. And this has been the case if you want from a scholarship regarding for university studies, if you want a medical treatment that might require for you to travel abroad. This has been the case regarding education. All the different sectors that the government is supposed to provide to its people has been very much centralized. So basically, if you're living in Sana'a, or if you're living in one of the main cities, you might get some of that benefits. But if you're living outside, or if you're living in the south, as Peter was mentioning, you are more, will not be able to get benefit of the government or the services that the government is supposed to be providing. In 2006 and 2007, when the Southern movement started protesting, and it started as a rights movement, people just coming out to the street, they are complaining actually that their salaries, and those were largely the people who were forced out of the Yemeni military after 1994 from the former Southern Army, after they were forced out of the military, their salaries hasn't, simply in simple words, are not enough anymore. So maybe that was enough back in 1994, but in 2006, if you're receiving the same wage as you were in 1994, and you have a big family, and your family are increasing in number, that's not enough for you at least to keep feeding your family members. Unfortunately, the Yemeni government, and I'm specifically saying this, the Sana'a government, failed to respond to that demands quite effectively. The Yemeni security and military forces went out to face those protesters. They shot them in the streets. Many people died. And many people started to feel maybe we were better off when we had a country of our own. If we went back to the situation before 1990, and maybe secession is better for the southern people. Interestingly, a number of places around Yemen that also happened. In Ma'rib, as an example, and it's a province that it's almost the richest province in oil and gas. Most of them, or the majority of people there, don't have access to basic services. They don't have access to electricity or water, and it's a very much tribal area. And this feeling of being marginalized and being excluded from the decision making, and the system was made in a way that the former President Saleh was able to focus all power and wealth in the center, in Sana'a and the surroundings of Sana'a. 80% of the Yemeni military come from two specific provinces. More than 90% of the Yemeni military comes from the provinces from Damar to Amran. That's almost 3 provinces out of almost 21. This type of government, many people, when it came to 2011, many people went out to the streets protesting change, but in other regions, they felt marginalized. The people in Ma'rib felt they are not part of the system. The people in the south, in Aden or in Mukalla, the reason why they went out, because they felt this system, this regime in Sana'a, is not inclusive enough, and they want a new type of system. Many of them were calling since 2011 for secession. The problem is that many of the elites who are focused in Sana'a and who are based in Sana'a kept on repeating that no, we will do reform, we will return back the lands that were taken since 1994, and that's it. And until today, surprisingly, that didn't happen. So the people of the former officers and soldiers who were forced out of their jobs since 1994 until today haven't got back to their work, despite all the promises from the governments. And many of the lands that were confiscated by the government did not return back to their owners, or to the people at least. And this created a huge sense of unfairness, and people feeling there is a certain elite inside Sana'a taking benefit of the wealth. They have control over the power, and that's not. This situation can no longer continue the way it is. And when we started to come to the discussion inside the national dialogue, this is where federalism was met as a solution. And interestingly, the only people who oppose the idea of federalism are the people who are members of that elite. The people, and I'm specifically focusing, the GPC in specific, the majority of them didn't like the idea of federalism. Almost half of the members of Islah didn't like the idea of federalism because it is in the interest of certain people who are representative of those two parties that they continue on holding the power and wealth in the center. This is why inside the national dialogue, we felt now federalism should be dealt as an issue, as a solution, and I do agree with many of the points that Peter mentioned, that this cannot just go in a separate way without meeting the basic services of the people. And the problem is that after 2013 and after the national dialogue concluded, the Hadi regime, almost in May or June, went to start a new fight against Al-Qaeda, which ended up actually, there wasn't an actual fight against Al-Qaeda in Shabwa, to divert attention from many of the commitments it made towards the people to say, we have a fight here, we fight a fight here, so now we're still not ready to meet those demands. I think until today, the challenge is still there, but I think continuing with a centralized system is no longer possible. If we want to build any form of government, we can start maybe, as Peter was saying, that many of the Iraq people are now forming some type of security. The security could be built from the local level and coming up, so people could feel being included within the system, and then reaching to some form of a federal system. And I am in favor of a federal system because it gives the sense of people that they are included within the decision making. The wealth is better being distributed. The people, especially in Hadramaut or in Marib, where the most of the oil and gas come out from, they feel that they have a share of that wealth, and they're not being marginalized. I think that concludes my point, and I'll be happy to receive your questions.
Thank you very much, Baraa, for your response, and thank you, Peter, for your presentation.